Today we're going to read Goodnight Moon and Goodnight Goon. Sorry about the conditions of Goodnight Goon. We've had that book for a while, so it's really bad in condition. But first we're going to read Goodnight Moon. Goodnight Moon by Margaret Wise Brown. Pictures by Climate Herd. In the great green room, there was a telephone, red balloon, and a picture of the cow jumping over the moon. And there were 3 little bears sitting in chairs, and 2 little kittens, and a pair of mittens, a little toy house, and a young mouse, and a comb and a brush, and a bowl full of mush. Quiet old lady who was whispering hush. Good night, room. Good night, moon. Good night. Good night, cow jumping over the moon. Good night, light in the red balloon. Good night, bears. Good night, chairs. Good night, kittens. Good night, mittens. Good night, clocks. Good night, socks. Good night, little house. And good night, mouse. Good night, comb, and good night, brush. Good night, nobody. Good night, mush. Good night to the old lady whispering hush. Good night, stars. Good night, air. Good night, noises everywhere. That's the first book. Next up, we have Goodnight Goon, which is like the same book, except it's with monsters. In the cold gray tomb, there was a gravestone and a black lagoon and a picture of Martins taking over the moon. There's 3 little mummies rubbing their tummies, and 2 hairy claws and a set of jaws. Claws and a set of jaws. And a loud screechy bat and a black hat. And a skull and a shoe and a pot full of goo. And a skull and a shoe and a pot full of goo. Hairy old werewolf who was hollering boo. Good night, Tomb. Good night, Goon. Good night, Martins taking over the moon. Good night, Bones, and good night, the black lagoon. Good night, mummies. Good night, please. Good night, claws, and good night, jaws. Good night, moans, and good night, groans. Good night, screechy bat. Good night, hat. Good night, skull. Good night, shoe. Good night, creature. Good night. Good night, goo. Good night to the old barrel. Halloween. Good night, you. Get under there. Good night, monsters everywhere. That was the end of Goodnight Goon. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye.